patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 126 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. Thank you all so much for joining me for this unique interview episode. We're going to be doing things a little differently today. Before we get started, though, a big shout out to our Patreon supporters, as always, for their fantastic support for this program. We're going to be adding some new features to our Patreon page, so if you haven't already, make sure to check out our Patreon page down in the show notes below. I really appreciate your support. Anything that you can do to support this program, I very much am so grateful for all of your help. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens. If you enjoy our content, you can also do that down in the show notes below. Today, we're going to be doing a special interview episode. Instead of me interviewing a guest, I'm going to be doing a collaborative interview episode with a good friend of mine named Francisco Kilgore, who runs his own podcast, and we thought it would be a great first-time episode, basically a podcast episode about podcasting. A lot of you have asked about the podcast process, and certainly when I go out and talk to people, it's always a topic that comes out, and so I'd like to give all of you an opportunity to hear firsthand from two podcasters to get a sense of what the podcasting process looks like, why we do what we do, and even some tips and resources on how to start your own podcast. Or if you know of anyone, you can certainly share this episode with your friends, your family, whoever might be interested in podcasting. We hope that this will be a good resource for all of you to use in the future. And let us know if you like to have more content on the podcasting process. I will first introduce Francisco here with his bio, and then we will cut straight into our conversation. Born and raised in Northern California, Francisco lives, works, and broadcasts from Sonoma, California. He graduated from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he majored in anthropology, a focus which fostered a fascination with and appreciation for humanity around the world. He has lived and worked on a dude ranch in Wyoming with nonprofits in Jordan, as well as startups and schools in Brazil. Despite his international journeys, he doesn't believe you have to travel the world to meet interesting people. You can start from your own backyard. And now let's cut right into our conversation about podcasting with Francisco. All right, Francisco, well, it is great to have this special episode to talk about podcasting. And Francisco, I'm going to let you start with a bit about how you started your podcast, Hello Sonoma.
Well, my Hello Sonoma podcast journey started out a couple years ago with a more traditional route, which was actually having a radio show. And I still have that radio show, local station KSVY 91.3 FM. Lovely station. I got invited there to do a PSA for the free meals we were giving out during COVID for the nonprofit that I worked for. And, you know, we just got to talking before recording and after recording, as I'm sure you know, Sherman, sometimes you have good conversations in those little time slots. And they said, you know, we have a couple of slots for some hosts if you're interested in applying. And I had a radio show in college, and so I applied. And that's the kind of genesis of how the show really started.
That's awesome. I remember meeting Francisco a couple years ago, and he was telling about the radio show, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. You know, especially just sharing about Sonoma County, and I think it's brilliant just how people like yourself really get into that space, having already familiarized yourself behind the microphone. I really came in cold. I mean, I've done speaking events before, but I was driving one time with my friend, and we were talking about podcasts, and I told him about how I was having this call with my friend from the UK, and we were talking about a podcast, and he said, you know, you should really have a podcast. And I was like, what? I don't think so, but yeah, I thought about it. I was like, okay, I'm going to share it with this friend of mine. I was back in Texas finishing up my master's degree, and this was right in the middle of COVID, so we were locked down, and we were on our way to Costco in Houston. At that time, that was the closest Costco to College Station, and we were having a conversation. I told him, said, well, I was thinking about podcasting, and my friend agreed. He said, I think it'd be great to try out this new medium. Not to mention everyone is in lockdown, and this would be a great project to work on. And since I was a kid, I always loved learning about American history and wanted to apply history to the present day, applying it to civics and politics. And so I graduated virtually, of course, with the master's degree. And then the summer after, I worked on the title and all the little bits. And of course, we're going to get into some of that a little bit later. But that was really how it started. It was started from some friends thinking that was a great idea. And then it took a little while for me to think that it was a great idea. And before we move on, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me for this. This is awesome. I've honestly, to you and to the audience, I've been thinking about this kind of episode for a very long time. And I keep telling myself, I'm going to do an episode about podcasting. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And finally, I think this is the right time to do it, especially as this month marks about 3 years since I've done this. And so I feel like it's just about time that we share a little bit about, since we've been doing podcasting for about the same amount of time, why don't we get right into it and do an episode? So Francisco, what do you want to start off with in terms of why podcasting, especially since you were coming from the radio side? Let's talk about why we got into podcasting.
Yeah, and you know what? You're right, Sherman. I totally put the cart before the horse, and I should thank you for so much for having me on this program. I kind of, you're kind of someone who paved the way, I think, for me in terms of this, someone to look up to, someone to be inspired. You have done so many episodes. You should be so proud of what you've been able to do, and your audience that you've accrued is pretty exciting. All of you out there tuning in. So it's been a wonderful journey for me, and I think for both of us to be able to share in that. That's one of the best parts. To just have someone else that you can discuss, that you can talk shop, that you can, figure out what you need to be doing.
Exactly. And thank you so much for the kind words, Francisco. Honestly, especially when we did the interview, I have to always acknowledge that Francisco was kind of have me on his podcast last year. And the way that Francisco does things, ladies and gentlemen, is awesome. And it's like, it's the quintessential way of scheduling an interview. And especially when we're in different time zones. I was in Central Time Zone at the time when we did our recording. And so these challenges really come about, but you kind of get used to it as a podcaster. But going back to the purpose of podcasting, the way I remember my time putting together podcasts was all about putting your voice out there. But not only that, it's also connecting with an audience. And you probably hear the word connection a lot, probably in our conversation today, but that really is what it's all about. It's not just the Wi-Fi connection that you need for a podcast interview. It's also the connection that you make with the listeners. And I really wanted to do something where I can invite people and have myself do long form content. And then podcasting, for me, at least, is the way to go, is because this is something you can do when you're doing almost anything else, whether you're exercising, whether you're driving to work, whether you're waiting for the bus, or whatever it is that you're doing. This can be more integrated within someone's life.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the word connection, because that's really what it's all about. For those of you who are tuning in who are wondering who the heck I am, my show is called Hello, Sonoma, and it really was born out of this idea of connecting with the people all around me. It's a small town. A lot of people think about Sonoma as a tourist destination, the town itself. The county is a touristy place that people come to. But as a resident and someone who grew up there, it's just a small town feel, you know. It's very similar to the small towns that I've been to all over the country. And I was curious about who those people are, who the people are who run the local grocery store or the local theater, who the people are that I've seen walking around town who are these kind of local icons. And there are not too many opportunities to connect with those people and to just talk with them and to hear their stories. So my program was born out of that curiosity about the people all around me. And I think you, Sherman, do something that's important, which is you know about the history, you know about the stuff you're talking about. You really research what you're doing, which is so important to give context for your listeners about what's happening now and how it relates to the historical context. And I try to research the people all around me to find out a little bit of their story beforehand so that we can have a deeper conversation. You know, it's kind of like when you meet someone the first time, you talk about the weather or you talk about their job. And I kind of like for our interviews to be like the third or fourth or fifth conversation that you might have with someone about their ideals or their values or their biggest inspirations, their heroes. And I think that's where true connections really form.
Yeah, well, Francisco, I like what you said about the research element, and without going too much into the technical areas of the research and the guest episodes, I want to jump on that point because so much of our episodes occurs before there's even the recording. You know, the researching the guest, contacting the guest. So much happens behind the scenes. I would say there's also some time of reflection of thinking what kind of episode do we want, or what kind of things can we expect from the product that we're planning. And it kind of goes back to that why element of like, why are we doing this? Right? Because I don't think you can make an episode without knowing why you're doing it. And I feel like what you are doing, especially with the little town of Sonoma, which I really love, people really need to visit. There's so many cool little historic spots. There's some great dining and shopping options there. By setting that mission, which I think you've clearly done, it really brings about a sense of purpose every time you hit the record button, you know, with a different guest or a different episode.
Yeah. And I definitely think even before the whole show starts, there's a certain element of research about what you want to talk about. You kind of mentioned your love of history and your desire to get things started. Was there a moment where you figured out how you were going to translate that interest into a show?
That's a great question. I wanted to ensure that people can be open about history and civics. I think that's the first starting point, which is the environment that you and I set. I think when we do an episode, and I recall from the recording that we've done, which is when people feel comfortable and when people know that this is a show that is not about, you know, about Democrats versus Republicans or Americans versus whatever country or this or that. When you break down those inherent barriers that for various reasons exist, then I think you really bring about the essence of someone and their perspectives, because then they feel like it's not just someone going, all right, here's my point of view, and I'm with this team or with that group, and that's all I want to say. You know, then it just becomes like, well, what's the point of having a conversation? Why can't you just record that person's perspectives? And the dynamic that I remember you set when we had our conversation was just like, I felt like we were in somewhere in Sonoma. Of course, I was somewhere in Kansas City at
In
the time.
Texas.
Yeah, a little different from Sonoma, but I remember us sitting down and just feeling like, okay, the best ideal scenario would be in person, but for you to be able to set that tone, I think is so critical, and I think it speaks to the kind of podcast that you put out and why you want to connect with people. And it's a brilliant thing.
Yeah. And I also think the way that you connect with someone is not through, for better or worse at the moment, not through like 3-minute clips that you hear in all kinds of other different media. Um, and there's something powerful about just, like you mentioned, this long form of being able to sit with someone. And if you're going to sit with someone for a long time, you sure better be comfortable. Or it's a lot easier to be comfortable if the goal is to make those connections, I think.
Yeah, I certainly didn't know. I didn't know I was going to put together a shopping list before I started doing podcasting. Because obviously, Francisco, you have a quality microphone, and so do I. And what's surprising maybe to some people is that the technical equipment is so essential to the podcasting element. So tell us about the equipment that you have, or just what that equipment is doing to elevate your podcast.
Totally. So I think my technological philosophy is that you don't have to have quote unquote the right equipment to get started. I just recorded an episode completely on my phone not too long ago because I just didn't have the right thing at the right time. Opportunity showed up to walk in the 4th of July parade, so I had my phone and I interviewed people. What else could I do? But once you reach, once you've got stuff going, it's about improving, about getting better. And so slowly I started getting more things. The radio station lent me this microphone, which I have right now. I can't tell you what kind it is because I'm not even sure myself. But I did get some little, what are they called? Wireless microphones. I got a special, I don't know if you want me to say the names of these things, a special H5, Zoom H5 recorder that has a little bit of capabilities. I'm still by no means an expert on these things. It's something that I'm learning, but I feel like I'm in phase 2 of the technological journey. The first technological journey phase is just get started on whatever you have if you really want to share something. The second phase is like learn and improve, where I definitely am. And the third phase is like really get insane because there's a lot of possibilities out there, I think. And what about you, Sherman? It looks like you have a pretty cool microphone rig going on. How did you figure out what you needed and pull the trigger on what you needed to buy?
Yeah, well, it came from the Pat Flynn channel. Pat Flynn, just as a quick reference, especially for those who listen to business podcasts, he does a great job of telling people how they should start podcasts. We'll obviously link that down in the show notes below. But he said, okay, you know what? These are the kinds of things that you should consider purchasing. So I really went the lazy way here. I was just like, okay, well, you're telling me to get these microphones, I'll get these kind of microphones. And so the setup is really just it's what's nice is that it's portable. It doesn't take up as much space as people expect. You can dismantle it and put it together quite easily and quickly. This is an Audio Technica microphone. I don't think they make this model anymore, which now it makes me feel old. But it's something I got a few years ago. The multiple purposes of a microphone. Like I've noticed that when I do calls with this microphone, it's not to say like people will be like, "Oh my gosh, now this person's Superman" or anything, but but it, the clarity of the voice I think makes it more real, and for whatever reason, it just sounds more authoritative. It, it gives you more confidence that you're speaking with someone, and it doesn't have that sort of, as we all are probably familiar with, that sort of computer mic sound, which that is just the standard quality. But it is what it is, and I think it's a phenomenal investment. And even if people are maybe not yet ready to go to podcasting, I highly recommend getting a good quality microphone. I just want to say podcasting in a way has given people clearer voices on the internet in a way.
Oh, yeah. Going from there's a famous saying on the internet for video that it looks like it was recorded on a potato. You remember in like 2008?
Yeah.
We're starting to learn about the audio equivalent of that, which is like, I don't know what that would be like a wax cylinder or something. But yeah, it is great to get a good microphone.
Let's look at the recording and the editing element. We're using Zencaster right now, which is free to use, and they do have a couple of payment options. But even for just a normal podcaster, I think this is a good investment. But just generally, Francisco, how do you feel about the recording equipment that you have developed with it comes to the editing and just capturing that audio? Because there's so many options out there, it probably can scare some people into thinking, oh gosh, if I start a podcast now, I have to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars into the software and the hardware and everything.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of options out there, and I by no means am the expert. As I mentioned, I'm in that phase 2 of constantly learning. There is a lot of technology that goes beyond the microphone, though that's clearly the most important part, probably. There's, as you mentioned, the actual recording software. If you're doing remote recordings, which are pretty helpful, I use a different software called Riverside, which is pretty similar. You can record audio. There's different ways to, there's different programs, levels, I guess. The free version, you can download all the audio files as one mono file. In other words, you can't separate out the two different speakers, but you can pay more to do that. And there's different benefits. So that's the recording software. The editing software, I use Adobe Audition, which is a paid software. There's, of course, GarageBand if you have a Mac computer. There's Audacity is a good one. So that's another part of the technological aspect. I also use a software called Descript to help edit out the ums and ahs and the hemming and hawing that happens, trying to go through things more quickly, especially because, we all have busy days. And so it's nice to be able to go through the interview pretty quickly. What else? I mean, there's so many different little aspects, everything from how to manage things beforehand, how to manage who you're reaching out to, your emails, your files, what happens to the files afterwards, where you host them. So Sherman, maybe you can talk about a little bit about your specific setup for how maybe you could just walk us through how an episode happens for you.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to first of all say that what you said about the technical elements, like what you're looking for and the files and features and whatnot, it's going to vary depending on the person. But I'd say one thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure that the technical stuff that you have, the hardware and the software, ensures that your voice is clear as possible, because there is nothing worse than than hearing a podcast and the podcast audio is just god awful. Now, sometimes, right? Sometimes it's not going to be as clear as you want it to be, because of the guest audio, right? Because not everyone has a microphone like you and me. But it still has to be clear, right? Like at least it has to be like a good phone call quality sort of audio. I recall trying to listen to a podcast. This someone had messaged me, a connection on LinkedIn messaged me, and he kindly asked if I could take a listen to his podcast. And he sounded like he had good content, but the audio was just not good. And this is one of the things that I try to warn people about, right? It's like, make sure the audio is good, because it can be the best quality in the world, but if you don't have the technology or the hardware to capture that audio, no one's going to ever find out, And so I just kind of put it out there as in case people are struggling, like, okay, which ones are going to be good for me in terms of the hardware and software. Make sure the sound, I it's my opinion, I think sound quality is what you need to go for, or at least maximize. But I guess in terms of the making an episode, once you get past the research elements, all that, and once we get to guests, I think we can probably speak more about that. But when it comes to putting together an episode, the first thing you got to think of is where are we going with this episode, right? Like what sort of topics do you really want to discuss? And the other element too, especially for a guest episode, which is what are some things that I know that this guest wants to discuss. And so it's a hard line to kind of walk, because maybe what you might want to prioritize might not be a priority for your guest. However, it's good to, I think, provide a good roadmap. And so I provide my guests an outline of some sort, just to kind of give them an idea of what sort of topics, because some of them have done a lot of different things, right? It's just hard to, imagine if I went to Francisco, okay, Francisco, we're going to do an episode. I want you to just talk about your entire life. Like it would just, then you'd be like, well, what parts of my life, right? What sort of areas are going to be more interesting than others? And it would just be such a pain. So I try to give a roadmap. And then when we do the recording, for the interview episodes, at least, I really defer so much of the audio. And I've improved on this a lot more, I think, ever since I started. But I try to make it at least 80% the guests speaking, because a lot of these I've never had, other than the original three guests I've had, I have not had a repeat guest. So I really consider each episode just treating it as the only time that this guest is going to be on the program. Now that might change. They might come on later or for another episode, but I really sit back, and the way I frame it is I try to just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show, because it really is that opportunity for that guest to speak his or her mind. And it's really nice, I think, to see, as you probably know too, probably talking to some people who have incredible stories relating to Sonoma and Sonoma County. But it just sitting back, I think, is and listening, and but also being that moderator, being the leader, and saying, okay, this is where we're going. That I think is what goes into a decent podcast episode.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it totally depends on what your focus is too. If you're doing those interview shows, figuring out who your inspirations are. There's this great book that I have that you've probably read called Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. Do you know that
I've
one?
heard of it. Yeah.
A great book about getting inspiration, being inspired. He has a couple of other books called like Show Your Work. There's another book called Making Ideas Happen by Scott Belsky. And I think it's important for you to figure out who you want to be like. I mean, not in terms of copying, but in terms of which aspects you want to aspire to. You talked about presenting a guest with the challenge of talking about their entire lives. It's kind of like presenting someone with the challenge of the entire podcast space, the entire audio space, and figuring out what your focus is going to be is important. And I think it's important to do that by being inspired. There's so many people to be inspired by. So I'm wondering, Sherman, if you have any people that inspired you in your journey, people that you looked up to, not necessarily that you copied, but just kind of got energy from.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought a lot about President George H.W. Bush when I started my podcast, because the first three guests who were on my program were all fellow Bush School students. So we were doing the same master's degree program. And I thought it would be not only a substantive reason to have them on, because they have expertise in all kinds of areas of foreign policy, but I also felt there was a symbolic element to having a, a set of guests from a school that was started by a president who earned a lot of respect on both sides of the aisle. And I felt that I wanted to try to channel that energy and that environment throughout all my episodes. So even though people might agree or disagree with a guest, and there have been times when I've had a guest on and someone says, "Oh, I just didn't feel like this person was conveying these kinds of views or something," but you just know that throughout the time that you're creating these episodes, that you think of the people who have set those standards of civility and of conversation. I mean, George H.W. Bush certainly knew how to converse with people. I mean, he conversed with all kinds of leaders and people from all different walks of life, and even up to the time of his passing, he still maintained those relationships. And so he wasn't the only figure, but I felt that because the podcast came out of this time when I was finishing my master's degree at the Bush School, I felt it was just fitting to have him as someone to look up to, especially when we know that times are very divisive now, and we know that there's a lot of work to do to have people come together. Going back to that theme of connection, right? Like you connect with the people who you admire, and then you connect with the people who you're having on. And I think with your podcast, Francisco, I think that's exactly what you do, is because you think you take the theme of Sonoma, right? The town of Sonoma, and you take that character and through your episodes, I think it really shines through, because when people from that town, they know people from that town, they've been there for years, right? They know, they live and breathe that town. And so having those kind of ideals, of knowing your own town and knowing how the people have shaped that, I think it really comes through your podcast.
Thanks, Sherman. Yeah, I mean, it's just important to have those personal connections in different ways, and to be able to shine a light on them, to highlight them, to make them feel special, and to make the community recognize them.
You obviously have had a lot of people on, and it's really remarkable. I just have to say, it's remarkable how people can make connections with this long form content. Like, I don't think people really expected this. I thought maybe people thought, okay, well, long form content, right? Well, it takes a lot longer to consume, right? And I just to kind of tie in with my question to you, I read a stat somewhere where the average time, attention span, I should say, for different media was studied, and they found that for blogs it was something like 1 to 3 minutes, something like that. I'm kind of guessing, but you can kind of get the sense of where we're going. For YouTube videos, I think the ideal time is about 6 or 7 minutes. After 6 or 7 minutes, people kind of get sick and tired of watching a video. For podcasts, what's amazing is that people can consume, the average consumption time of a podcast was something like 40 or 45 minutes, which is significantly longer than the kind of content that we were used to. And so with the guests now, bringing that different perspective and people listening to them for so long, what's been your experience working with guests? Like, I guess, well, let's start from the more of the beginning here. How do you initiate that process of getting them on board for the episode recording?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of goes back to the values of the program. I mean, what the program is all about. And for me, not only is it about connection, but it's about compassion, it's about curiosity, and it's about making the guests look as good as possible. Like, in other words, to show the best version of that person. So most people are pretty receptive to that kind of conversation. It's while we don't shy away from challenging topics, it's not like I'm trying to put them on the spot. And so usually I just go approaching people. At the beginning, it was tough. It was tough to find guests. I had a list of probably 10 or 20 people that I thought would be interesting as a starting place. And that list has grown significantly. And at the beginning, I was just asking, if you know anybody at the end of an episode that you'd be curious about learning a little bit about their story, let me know. And the length of the episode changed, and the format of the episode changed since the beginning. Originally, since the radio hour is split up into 3 20-minute segments, I thought I would have 2 guests in each of the two of the 20-minute segments, 1 20-minute segment of music in between, and that would be the format. And eventually that changed completely to just 1 guest over the whole hour, which goes about 45 minutes of the guests talking to about an hour. And so, just telling people that they're going to have this chance to be on the radio, to be on the community radio. I think it really helps that this is a real Sonoma-based situation, that it's going to be on the internet afterwards as a podcast, so they can share with friends and family wherever they might be. But emphasizing those values of compassion and curiosity and listening really helps get people on board. How about you, Sherman? How do you get people on?
It's kind of similar to your story, and there's 2 things that I think we've done the same. I think I've worked quite well. The first is really coming up with an initial list, especially when you're starting. I know maybe some people out there who are listening might be thinking of starting a podcast or know someone who wants to start a podcast. And the amount of preparation that you have to do, I think, to start, it's not huge. It's not like you can't get through it within a few weeks or so, but you still need to have an idea, like of who you want to have on the program. And I think that's a great little tip that you have, which is putting out a list of people you're interested, and just know, right? Like you want to have you have to cast a wide net, especially initially when you don't have anything really to show people. Just like, okay, I want to start a show. I don't have any content yet, but I'd love to have you on. So it's going to be hard, I think, in the beginning, as you pointed out.
We talked about technology. One piece of technology that's way old school is a business card. I have another Thursday morning radio show, and I needed to get 6 guests every Thursday. So in total, that's 7 people a week that need to come onto the program. So you can best believe now I'm totally not shy at all about handing out my business card and saying, come on, you got to be a part of this program somehow. And that is definitely a very important part of bringing people on board. But
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now I want a business card that you mentioned it. Uh, and the confidence that you put out, and kind of related to that second point, which is reaching out. And I know it sounds so simple, right? But if you don't reach out, you'll never know. And I can tell you that, and Francisco, you might be the same way too. But it's like there's a lot of people who very interesting people for whatever reason, maybe because everyone's kind of piled up in emails, or they just don't have time, or they think I'm an A-list guest. I'm not gonna. I don't really want to speak to this person who's not a Joe Rogan. Whatever that reason is, you're always going to run into rejections or no answers, and it's a natural thing, right? You know what I mean? Like especially when I started, it's like, okay, well, got my 3 buddies who I kind of made them come on to the podcast. Well, I mean, they wanted, but
that's a good place to start.
That's right. Yeah. So it's like, at least you start with someone, right? Then you build that track record over time. And I've noticed, at least personally, I've noticed that once you build a track record, then people are like, oh, all these people have come on. I want to be a part of it. And so when you have that history, it really helps a lot. But it's tough. It's not hard. I think everyone's just afraid of rejection. I think that's what it is. I don't know how you feel about that, Francisco, in terms of like how overcoming that initial sort of like, oh geez, I have to approach people, I have to cold email people. People never heard of me, but this is how you get started. Otherwise people will never have a podcast if they never approached anyone.
Yeah, that's super true. I'm trying to remember how I did it going back. You know, as you mentioned, it's all about the people that you know already. So my first 10 or 20 guests were people that I knew through my work or through my friends' works, who I didn't really have to do that much explaining. We were basically friends. And then the hard part came after that. But there was something to be said about that social proof of showing, hey, I've already done 20 episodes. You can listen to one. They're on my website. They're on the podcast areas. You can see the kinds of questions I'll ask you. And then reaching out via email. Yeah, it's, for one strategy that I did is I went to some Chamber of Commerce events or different events around town, whether they be conferences or anything, and just gather business cards or gather a program. And I have this program here of the Sonoma Chamber of Commerce, Sonoma Valley Local Fest, for example. This is very related to my audience. I just went through all of the different websites, searched for them on Instagram or whatever, and just sent them a message. And 90% are not going to respond. That's okay. The 10% that do, you can ask them, hey, if you had a good experience after the interview, tell me about a couple more people. So that's how it started.
I appreciate the frankness that the 90%. I think it's somewhere along that number too for me. And you have to. And I know some people are like, oh, 90%. That's huge. But the way I think it would be useful for people to know is that now you value that 10% so much more. If every single person, et cetera, would it really be the same sort of value, of reaching out and spending all this effort to reach out to that person? Probably not. Because then everyone is kind of just a number. It's like, oh well, if you don't want to be on the podcast, or if you can't be on the podcast for whatever reason, then I've always got someone else. Well, I think when you make that effort, as you said with Francisco, with your business cards, you make that effort and that connection by giving them something tangible to say, hey, here's a way to listen to my program, here's a way to contact me. Then people see that door, and I think maybe they're more likely to walk through it and be like, you know what, this man sounds interesting, and going back to the confidence element, I mean, this is going to take confidence. It's going to take this acceptance of reality, saying, look, guess what? In the entire world, not every single person on this planet is going to want to be on the podcast or even like you, but
Yeah,
that's the way it is, right? Like,
that is the
there's
way
no
it
way
is.
around it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, anyway, I just say that because it's a leap of faith, certainly in the beginning, but then you realize that people might have their own reasons, but you just keep carrying on. You keep doing what you're doing, and it does. And I don't think any rejection or any guess that you couldn't have on the program, I don't think that should let you be disappointed. There's always someone else out there who most likely would have been better fit for you anyway.
Yeah. And going back to choosing who to have as guests, I've kind of entered into the second phase. The first phase is like, please, somebody come on my show. I need to start this and it
I
needs
feel
to
you.
happen.
So,
And
way
now,
back 2020, you know.
yeah, it's tough. And you kind of work through it, and there's no other way to do it. It's kind of like I envision it as, have you ever handed out pamphlets at some kind of public event?
I have. Yep.
I mean, 99% of people say no to those, but you just got to do it. That's how you find people find out about it. And so I've entered the kind of second half of that, which is choosing who to have on, um, and choosing who I'm going to reach out to instead of just kind of spraying everywhere. And for that, I've been thinking about a lot about who haven't I had on? What kind of voices haven't I heard yet? That is, if the show's supposed to represent Sonoma, um, how can I best do that? So I'm going to interview a veteran soon who I hadn't interviewed a veteran before. And if we're talking about people's stories, that's important. I interviewed someone who also has a podcast. That's an important part of different people's experiences. And just kind of thinking about how can I make this make sense for the audience? I'm sure that you have that experience. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people that you could interview, but whittling it down to the people you want to reach out to is probably a process in itself.
Exactly. And the process of going out and trying something new, that can also be a challenge too, right? Because everyone wants to just keep doing the same thing, right? It's just kind of a natural tendency. But to your point about trying something new or reaching out to a new kind of guest, it's also one of the more exciting elements of podcasting, because when you reach out to these people, I will tell you, I don't have a number right now, but a lot of times I've never even heard this person speak. I don't even know if that person has ever, in terms of like a public speaking, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
I've never heard of a podcast episodes or a YouTube video, but I just know sometimes it's a gut feeling. Like it's hard to say, but when you read through the bios, you read through the kind of work, and then you get a sense of what that person is about. It's a leap of faith. It really is. It's a gamble, however you want to put it. But when you reach out and you have some kind of evidence that's kind of backing up your gut feeling, saying, I've got a feeling this person could really like this podcast. Then and once you get past that, then you can start doing the work. And assuming that person accepts, right? Then you know that you know what the audience is looking for, and you know how to execute it. And it's a muscle. It really is. I can't tell you that, even when I said something about the outline or sort of roadmap that I provide, it has been refined. It's the general format. Surprisingly, is the general format has been pretty much the same. But when it comes to the refinement of where you want these episodes to go, and with the new guests especially, I feel like it's such a reassuring thing for the podcasters, you and me, to provide that direction. I think it's a leadership element when it comes to guests, especially with solo episodes. You're kind of just doing your own thing, and I'm not saying that you're not leading anything. I'm just saying that you can talk about whatever you want, right? You can say whatever you want and plan out however you want. But when you're working with people, especially people who you've never even heard of, in terms of literally hearing from the video or from a podcast episode, the responsibility that you have as a podcaster really ramps up. And now you're going back to what we were saying earlier, setting the tone, right? Setting those characteristics, setting the logistics. It's all on you. And anything that happens, right or wrong, on the podcast is all on us. And the guests, I think, teach me a lot, not just through the content. I don't know if you'd like to share maybe a bit about what the guests mean to you in terms of that connection element. But these guests, I am so grateful for their time and energy, because a lot of them don't have to do this. They don't have to go on to my podcast or even anyone's else's podcast, but they choose to do so. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful for the time and energy that they give to share their opinion, especially with someone who they've never met in person. And I just want to make that point about how much these guests really mean to us as podcasters.
Oh yeah, the guests are everything. I feel so lucky that these many people from Sonoma and beyond have all said yes to this thing that's so special to me, which is this program, and that it's even for the audiences who listen to them. You know, you never really know who you're going to inspire or who you're going to impact in one way or another. There's a great TED Talk of a guy who talks about having lollipop moments. And I won't share the whole story here, but essentially, he was one of the welcome people at a university. And during this welcome event, he helped two people become friends. And as he was retiring 30 years later, these two strangers appeared at the door and said, we were at one of your welcome events 30 years ago, and now we're married. And he talks about how life is full of moments like those where you never really know the impact that you have on the people, because there often isn't a chance for that moment to be shared. And so I certainly feel grateful to all my guests for sharing their time with me, and knowing that in one way or another, they're probably going to impact someone who listens and inspire them going forward. So I think that's pretty special. So I have a question for you, Sherman. You've talked to a lot of people. You've created a lot of episodes. As of this recording, more than 120 episodes, which is pretty awesome. I think through that, you've accrued some knowledge. You've accrued some wisdom. I'm wondering if you were talking over coffee or over breakfast, whatever your favorite breakfast is, with Sherman from 2020, who started the podcast, what would you tell him?
Oh, that is a brilliant question. Well, that's the question of the year for me. But, well, first of all, it's got to be over either classic like American breakfast, or I go for an English breakfast too.
Okay,
I mean, that's just
little international spice there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think what I would tell the 2020 Sherman, saying there is so much out there that one needs to learn about, but having guests on and having this podcast is going to be the start of many learning experiences about all these different topics. It's not, I always try to imagine the podcast as a learning tool, because not only are you getting information, or you're allowing information to be broadcast on your show, but you also know that, in line with the theme of civics and of connection and conversation, this is only the beginning of the kinds of interactions that you're going to have. And so, I would tell the 2020 Sherman, treat every single interview episode not just as a standalone, as okay, I've already covered this, so I'm done with this topic, or I feel like I've talked enough about this. I cannot tell you one episode where I'm like, okay, I feel like we've covered this enough. Like, I don't think there's ever going to be that. But where is the podcast going to go in terms of the progression of that conversation? And that's something I didn't really understand when I was starting, because a lot of times it's really just the hustle, right? It's like, okay, you want to get through these podcast episodes, or you want to get stuff out. But then when you reflect back and know, wow, there's still a lot of things that I'm learning about, or things I didn't know about. I had a guest on. It's the only episode I've had so far about this topic, but it was about agriculture policy, and I've never lived on a farm ever. But now that I appreciate that topic so much, it's now a representation of how much more we can learn. And it's hard to get that feeling when you first start, but after doing it for 3 years, and for you for doing it for about a couple years, a bit more, maybe more than that, and that's not including the time you've done with radio, that I feel like the learning process becomes more real when you've done all these episodes in a way that you couldn't have had, in a way that you couldn't have had before you've had the podcast. Now it's like, okay, here are all the topics I've covered, but these are all the topics that I will continue to cover, right? Like you didn't know that a lot of these topics were out there, but now that you know, now those become your lessons, and those become ways that you connect with your audience. And not to mention that, as you were kind of alluding to, those could be people you could run into in 30 years. And so it's surreal. It's surreal how long of a process it is, but at the same time, I would do it all over again. And as you probably would, if you were to start over, if you were to do it again, I'm sure you would do it in a heartbeat. And it's probably because of all those people who have had confidence in us to begin with. And also, I think it maybe just the way that we conduct ourselves, and how the kinds of pillars that we put in our podcast, I think, attracts those kinds of people to listen and to be a part of the show.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's pretty good advice for a slightly younger Sherman.
Yeah. I would be like, well, this breakfast is going to be the longest breakfast ever. But well, that's great, Francisco. Honestly, to share about the story you told about that gentleman, with people coming 30 years later being married. I mean, talk about an impact on people's lives. And what sort of moments do you remember? And let's think of like maybe good and bad moments, or moments that didn't work out for us. Like there's got to be some times when you felt like, wow, this is such a cool moment. And there are times when like, is this really happening? Like, could really wish that we could have gone this way.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is I had one guest who I was really excited about, who, for whatever reason, just the technology was a real barrier. We started recording, the phone died, couldn't back on the internet cut out. And so we ended up, typically my recording sessions are about an hour and 15 minutes, like slightly longer than the full radio episode is going to be, just talking about different things. This one ended up being, 3 or 4 hours over 3 or 4 different occasions, which was wild. But I think there was something to be, and my guest was so apologetic. She's so kind. And she was so sorry that all this stuff was happening, and often offered to just not do the episode because it might be too complicated. But afterwards, once it was out there, she was so happy, and her friends were happy. And I had people come up to me and talk about how important that was to be able to hear her story, because it was just learning about somebody in a new way that they hadn't had that opportunity to before. So persevering in the face of those technical difficulties. I've had other people not be able to do, for whatever reason, not be able to record properly, but that was the most chaotic one. And it ended up being really great. And now we're good friends. On the other side, because it's a local program for the most part, I do interview people from other states, other countries, all over the world. But for the most part, it's a local program. So I've been able to do in-person Hello Sonoma parties. And those have been really special. I think maybe you might feel this way, but when you're in a small town, it feels like you know everybody. And when you go, you recognize the same people's faces. You see them whenever in the typical places that you go to. But these parties have been interesting because people will go and often not know anybody else except for me. And for all of the guests to feel that way is a pretty special occasion because they all have those values, right, about compassion and curiosity. So they're all curious about each other, and they end up making new friendships. So that was certainly a positive experience where people come away from these in-person gatherings and are able to say, wow, I'm so glad that I met this person. Their story was really impactful, and I think we're going to be friends now.
Thank you all so much for listening to part 1. If you're enjoying this conversation, be sure to check out part 2, which is linked in the show notes below.